Welcome to the third lecture in Module 5. Now, in the previous lecture, we went over basically how HTTP works. Now, in the next two lectures, we'll look at first the request side of that protocol and then the response side of the protocol. So here we're going to consider the request side of the protocol. Now, the client side of this protocol for an HTTP 1.1 request consists of three parts. The first is a request line. The second is a header. And finally, there could be a message body. Let's take a look at each of these piece by piece. The request line identifies the resource. For example, if you think back to the previous lecture, we had a get index.html. The resource in this case is index.html, along with the desired action or the request itself. And the request in the previous example was a get request. The resource is typically identified by what's known as a URI, a universal resource identifier, and a URL is just a specific case of that. So www.unm.edu is a URL. Now there are 9 different types of requests that you can make in HTTP 1.1. Let's take a look at each of them. You could make a head request. And this is the same as a GET request. We saw the GET request previously when we requested index.html and the server returned it to us. But in this case, if you do a head request, this is a lot of times just used for debugging purposes. It's a GET request, but nothing's returned from the server. The GET request is a very common request. It's typically the first thing that happens in a web application. So you request a resource with a GET request. A POST is how you submit data to a web application. So a POST request typically has a portion in the body that contains what you'd like to store on the server side. So it's creating a new resource on the server side. Delete. Delete is one you should be aware of. This is how you delete a resource on the server side. And then I'll let you read through these others, but primarily we'll be using get, post, and delete in our web application architecture, so you should understand how those work. There's also a last one here, this patch request. So let's talk a little bit more about the head, get, options, and trace. These are referred to as safe methods, and what that means is that they should not produce any side effects on the server. So it's important for you to understand that. You don't want to write something on your server side that accepts a GET request and actually changes the database. That would be violating this principle that these are supposed to be safe methods. So safe methods are just intended for information retrieval. So for example, when we did get index.html, we're just trying to retrieve that HTML and not change it in any way. So if you implement GET methods in safe ways, as I've just described, where they don't change the state of the server side, then you can execute many of them, the same request, and it'll always do the same thing. It will never change the state of the web application. What this means is that the server can cache that request. The next time you make it, it can just return that response without having to do any computation on the server side. This is one of the things we talked about previously that speeds up web applications, makes them more responsive. So the other side of this, you have these post, put, and delete methods, which can cause side effects. You would expect if you post something new that it would change what's on the server, or if you delete something. So these aren't safe methods. However, they should satisfy this property that they're idempotent, which means that if you execute multiple of these requests in a row, they shouldn't. The first request is the only one that should change the server, and after that, the same effect should occur. So, as an example, if I delete the same resource 10 times, the server should look the same after each of those 10 delete requests. You wouldn't want a delete request to delete a resource, make the same one, and something else was deleted. So this is this notion of idempotent. So, by the way, if you think about it, safe methods are, just by their very nature, idempotent as well. So, the second part of the request is the header. And this is really the primary part of the request, right? So it contains kind of the parameters of the request. And there's a syntax that's used throughout the header. and it is the name of a field, a colon, followed by a field value. And here's some examples. Here's a common one that you see. This accept field specifies the content types that are acceptable to the client. And so, again, think about the fact that we're making an HTTP request. And as a part of that request, your client is saying, I can accept, in this case, plain text. HTML, in other words, right? Another one that you commonly see is a language type. The language that I'm expecting to be returned to me is English, U.S. English in particular. So these, again, this follows this syntax. There's the name of the field, accept in the first case, and accept-language in the second, followed by a colon, right? And then the field value. And so this is how, by the way, you can internationalize applications. You can look at, on your server side, you can look at the language that somebody's working with, and then return data according to the language. This is how you internationalize applications. So there's a whole set of these. I'm not going to go over all of them, but the main thing I want you to be able to do is as you use your developer tools in the browsers, you can see them, and you'll see there's quite a few of them. If you go to this Internet Engineering Task Force, they've defined a bunch of these, and you can take a look at them, and you can see what's available for you to use in this case. Rails does a lot of this automatically for you, but when you debug an application, you need to be aware of what these things mean. Now, the next thing is the message header. It's very important. It must be separated from the message body by a blank line. So the header field, blank line, and then you can include a body as a part of the request. Let's take a look. In order to demonstrate what happens on the client side with an HTTP request, I've opened up a web page, and let me go to open the developer tools, and I'm using Chrome in this case. So if I open the developer tools, I see now a window down here, and I'm going to go ahead and refresh this page, and you'll see some activity in the developer tools at the bottom. And I'm going to move to the very top of all of these activities that just are recorded here. And again, this is under the Network tab. And if I select www.unm.edu, I see there's a get, that it's a GET request, and I see the status 200 was returned, meaning that it's okay, and that text.html or text /HTML was returned. And let's look at the request itself. If I click on www.unm.edu here, you see that the request URL is provided here, http://www.unm.edu. The method was a GET. And then we can look at the request header itself, and we see that it's get HTTP 1.1, the host. And here's an example of some of the headers. This specifies that we can accept HTML, XHTML, XML, and this Q indicates the quality that we'd like to receive. The user agent here we're saying is that this is my browser, it's Mozilla. I'm using a Apple Macintosh computer, so on and so forth. So these are all the headers that are a part of the HTTP request. Now, as I've said, the message body in an HTTP request is optional. Typically not there for a GET request, but for a POST, there generally is a body. So this is, again, the data that you're trying to supply to the server side. And you can also have various characteristics that are defined in fields. And so an HTTP request includes a body. There's usually something in the header that says what type of data is being supplied. So there could be a content type that specifies the MIME type that's going to be supplied in the body. And it could be text HTML, it could be an image, a GIF file. Again, you're just telling the server, this is what my body contains. And sometimes you'll see a content length that specifies how many bytes are in the message body as well. This completes the third lecture in Module 5 that deals with the request side of the HTTP protocol.